Was there anything that really stood out for you from the last two nights?
The short answer is no. And then let me immediately amend that by saying the one thing that was, I think, really important, and I think it will be seen down the road, not immediately as important, was Tulsi Gabbard's articulation of a principled non-interventionist foreign policy in the first Democratic debate. It was a kind of electrifying moment there. I think it's the only fully memorable event in either of the two debates. From a position of experience as well as a position of understanding the past 20 years of foreign policy, she said, we are doing bad things in the world that are not even working by their own, standards of success or levels of success. We need to start doing things differently. I think that's tapping into something that's really important because the Democratic Party is a place where that message needs to really take root and I think start to expand out across Democrats into the Republican Party and become a new consensus. And the American people are already there. A majority of people, a growing majorities of people in polls show that they're sick of our foreign policy. They recognize, it's been years since people have recognized that both Iraq and Afghanistan were mistakes, both in conception and certainly in execution. And I think it's really great to see a major presidential candidate starting to articulate that. I think it's going to be similar to the way when Ron Paul did something similar, several presidential cycles ago, when we were still much more locked into the war on terror mentality. People were like, oh, that's the end of him. And it actually kicked off a wide discussion about things and really changed the way that the Republican Party talks about stuff.
It's interesting for me because I really became politically aware after the Iraq War and during the opposition to the Iraq War. And during that period, it seemed as though the Democratic Party was the peace party, even in the corporate media, shows like Bill Maher. I know you've been on his show many times. And there was a strong opposition to not just the Iraq War, but really broadly what the Bush administration was doing. And it seemed at the time, again, like the Democratic Party was the peace party. Since then, you had several instances during the past couple nights where there was ranting against China, against Russia, against North Korea. And Tulsi Gabbard really does seem like an outsider because she's a peace candidate. Why do you think it is that the Democratic Party in about 10 years' time have become such hawks?
Well, there's two answers to that. One is that for all of the Cold War period and actually for all of the 20th century, basically the Democratic Party was as hawkish or more hawkish than the Republican Party. And when you think about people like Woodrow Wilson, who got us into World War II, FDR was an early proponent of joining World War II. Harry Truman in Korea, LBJ, Kennedy and LBJ in Vietnam, and the list goes on. The Democratic Party has always been hawkish. And that was the consensus for America up through, the end of the Cold War, pretty much, that we were the indispensable nation. We had to be everywhere and, occupy places so that the Russians didn't, and also transform parts of the world that were backwards or, making, I guess it was Wilson's phrase about making the world safe for democracy. And then what happened was when Bush went to invade Iraq, I mean, forget about Afghanistan for a second. And there was, that whole kind of hysteria, which was somewhat understandable after 9/11, when the Patriot Act was passed and the original authorization of use of military force to go after al-Qaeda and everybody who was, somehow related to 9/11. That was essentially a unanimous vote. Ron Paul and a couple of other people voted against the Patriot Act, but that was about it. And the mood of the country was in a particular place. But even for the Iraq War, Democrats overwhelmingly supported that. They supported the Iraq invasion in the early 2000s at higher levels than they did when we invaded Iraq in the early 90s. What happened was the war went poorly, and Barack Obama campaigned kind of softly as a peace candidate, which of course he turned out not to be. But that ended the anti-war movement, because the anti-war movement in America, unfortunately, and during the Bush years, it ultimately was mostly an anti-Bush movement and an anti-Republican movement. The minute a Democrat got into the White House and started doing basically the same things, among other things, Obama tripled troop strength in Afghanistan to absolutely no lasting effect on anything. He cranked up drone warfare in various places. We deposed Gaddafi in Libya, et cetera. I mean, he had a very muscular foreign policy, and the anti-war movement was nowhere to be found. And I think that's part of the problem, and that is why Gabbard, I think, is interesting, because she's bringing that back to life. And this time, it's in sync with the American people. We're done with the global war on terror. We understand that whatever was going on, it didn't work, and most of that has passed. We can deal with we can deal with terrorist acts against America and keeping America safe without having to be in every country and projecting force throughout the globe in a way that has yielded nothing, other than a completely destabilized Middle East, at this point in time.